Hi, folks. Welcome to the Writing to Learn conference. We're really glad to have you here. I'm Mary Tedrow, the director of the Writing Project, and hopefully you are here because you would like to see my presentation on learning past deficit. There's just a couple of things I want to let you know as we get started here. One is that you will find it useful to have the handout open. You can find that in the link down on the site, and we will be using parts of that as we go through the presentation. Secondly, since you are watching this as a video, you have the option to stop when you need to, and I hope that you will stop periodically to participate in the activities. I've put a pause button on the screens where I would ask you to pause the video so that you can do some of the writing. This presentation is intended to be interactive. If we were in a room together, you would be sharing your writing and your thoughts with the other teachers in the room. We know that teachers are a fountain of information, and I'm sorry that you don't have your colleagues with you to share the thoughts that you all have and the experiences you've had in your classroom. So we're going to start right away with a little bit of writing, and one tip I would like to give you before we get started is that in my classroom, I frequently have my students stop and write before we discuss things. I plan out some prompts that engage them with the curriculum. And then I generally give them a few minutes to write first before perhaps they turn and talk with their peers, or maybe they share out in the large group. This is a great way to engage every student in the classroom with the thinking that you want them to do. The difference when you just ask them to turn and talk is that that's really easy if you're an extrovert, because extroverts process out loud. Introverts, and I am an introvert, are slower processors, and they do a lot of their thinking in their heads. So if you ask your students to stop and write first, and then ask them to turn and talk or share with the large group, that means that everybody will get an opportunity to think about the subject before they get run over by those extroverts in the group. So keep that in mind when you go through this and see how the writing helps you or process what it is I'm asking you to think about. So the first pause that I'm going to ask you to do is to write about your reaction to the following quotation. When you feel you've written all you have to say, then you can just start the video back up. Don't pause yet. Here's the quote. This is by John Trudell. I'm going to read it to you so that we're all together. When I was in high school, they drugged me into the principal's office and told me I had a lot of potential, but that I needed to learn how to study hard and make something of myself. And that's when I quit school, because I realized that we weren't operating on the same level of reality. Because, you see, I knew that I already was something. Now pause. And then just gather your thoughts. Remember, this is writing to think, so don't worry about grammar or things like that. Just jot down your thinking around this quote. So hopefully you're back. Usually what I have heard from teachers when they're in a group and they think about this quote is how sad it is that this person felt that he had no place in school, or perhaps that school did not recognize him for already being somebody of worth and value. He's not the only one who had this thinking. James Baldwin also has another comment that he made about this idea that we need to see our children when they come to us in the classroom. He says, "A child cannot be taught by anyone who despises him, and he cannot afford to be fooled. A child cannot be taught by anyone whose demand, essentially, is that the child repudiate his experience and all that gives him sustenance, and enter a limbo in which he will no longer be Black, and in which he knows that he can never become white. Black people have lost too many children that way. So of course, Baldwin was writing this about African American students, but we now have very diverse classrooms where our students come to us from all kinds of cultures. And if we are asking them to shed that culture when they walk in the classroom and become someone else, just as John had commented in the last one, then we're going to lose a lot of children that way. So what I'm going to talk about today is, and ask you to think about today, is how we can invite our students to bring themselves fully into the classroom, and we can recognize what assets they are bringing with them, and then build on those assets and bring them into further improvement or to help them reach the goals that they have when they come to us in school. So before we get started, now's a good time. Some of you are already in school, some of you are about to get in school. Take a few minutes to jot down your understanding of the levels of ability and access to standard American English that is represented in your classes or your class. Of course, for those of you who are not yet in front of a class, rely on your experience with past classes. You know, what do you see coming into your classroom year after year? So pause the video and jot some notes down because you're going to want to come back to those later. So what I'm going to talk to you about now is the idea of literacy, and what it is, and how it appears in our own life. In a few moments, I am going to ask you to record how literacy appears in your life. I want you to do this so you can understand what you might be asking students to do about their own literacy. But before we do that, I want to be sure that you understand what I mean by literacy. I'm sure there are times when you might read for pleasure. Perhaps you have a book going, or you have a magazine or a blog that you like to read. You might also have to read for information. Maybe you read the news, or you have to read some kind of directions. Certainly all of us as teachers have things that we have to read every day in order to get through our job, to understand new software, all those things. That there is a certain literacy that you employ during your workday. So one of the things I'm going to ask you to think about is, when do you read during the day? When do you write? What kinds of things are you asked to write? What kinds of talk are you using? Of course, we're in front of students, we're in front of adults, we write emails, so I want you to think about what kinds of literacy are employed in the work that you do. But now I want you to think a little differently about other kinds of reading. For instance, when you walk into a new environment, you probably read the room. You look to see who's in there. How do they seem to be dressed? What's the grammar of the room? A grammar, by the way, as an English teacher, I'll just describe to you that grammar means the underlying rules. So it isn't just about commas and capital letters. All kinds of things have a grammar to them. For instance, if you go into a hotel lobby and you've been in them before, there are certain things you can anticipate being in that lobby. If you've never been to a hotel or seen a lobby, the rules of the room are going to be new to you. You might not realize that there should be a registration desk somewhere. There's probably some areas for seating. Probably one of the ante rooms contains an elevator. All of those are the grammar of a room. So you might look around to see if there are places for sitting or for talking. This is especially apparent when you enter an eating area with open seating for the first time, like a cafeteria, a place where our kids go to socialize, and they're going to scan that room to figure out who's sitting where, What places look friendly? What are the places to avoid? How does the line seem to work? These are all things that we have to read when we go into a space. We also read clothing. Are there people who look like an authority? Is there a rebel, a fun person? These are all kinds of texts that we encounter through the day, but they require the same kinds of thinking that reading of printed text or visuals require. For instance, from my own experience, many of the students that I had who were at risk or considered at risk, when we read stories and poetry, were excellent readers of character, probably better than my honors student. But I'm sure that they lived a life where it was really important to read people quickly and know what their intentions were. So if you're in a chaotic situation, understanding who can be trusted, who can't, would certainly be an important skill. And these transfer almost entirely directly to text. So we read rooms, we read clothing, we read people. Maybe you have a religious or a spiritual life, and there are texts that are a part of that life that require certain awareness in order for you to negotiate these texts. And there could be some reading and analysis of them. But also think about what in your household requires different kinds of reading and writing. Maybe the kitchen area, maybe directions for putting things together. Are there storytellers in your house? You know, our students come to us, maybe they weren't read to, but maybe somebody tells stories. So who tells the story and why? So what I'm going to ask you to do is stop the video again and take about 5 minutes to list as many literacies you can pinpoint to in your life. But I also want you to think about what literacies you are currently working on. For instance, I am currently working on online instruction. That's a new literacy for me, as I'm sure it is for many of you. So we can include that in our list of literacies we are working on, things that we are trying to use. So I want you to make a list. Sometime, perhaps you'll have the opportunity to compare this list with a colleague who has participated in the presentation and seen what literacies they have working for them in their life. Excuse me. So now that you've thought about literacy, I want you to understand what literacy is and how it works in our lives. First of all, literacy is a social practice. We practice literacy in order to get things done, in order to reach our own goals, in order to do tasks. Hopefully your list indicates a number of those literacies. So it's best understood as a set of social practices. And these can be inferred from events which are mediated by written text. So anytime you do something that requires you to interact with text in order to achieve something, you are practicing the social practice of literacy. There are also completely different literacies associated with different domains of life. If you're a musician, you have a whole separate literacy that I do not have. If you are interested in something like my grandson is, like Roblox, he can speak Roblox to me. I don't know what he's talking about, but it has an entire literacy to it. I had a student once who was studying up for an auto mechanics contest. He showed me his textbook, which was about that thick. And of course, it had all kinds of terms and diagrams and things that I had no awareness of. So he was extremely literate in that particular domain of his life. Our literacy practices are patterned by social institutions and power relationships. We shift our language when we are subservient or when we are in authority. We also know certain expectations by the social institution, and school is a social institution, and it has its own separate rules and practices that, of course, some students are going to feel more comfortable with than others. Some literacies will be more dominant and visible in those social institutions than others. In school, one of the reading and listening are two literacies that are privileged. Speaking and writing are generally not as privileged, though they are important literacies for our students to practice as well. Literacy practices are purposeful. You engage them because you're trying to get something done, and they are embedded in broader social goals and cultural practices. So we get our kids into academic literacy so that they can do all the jobs and reach the goals of the different curriculum. Literacy is also historically situated. Obviously, we don't speak like Shakespeare anymore, so our language is always changing. Our social goals and practices are always changing, so it all changes over time. And finally, literacy practices do change, and new ones are frequently acquired through the process of informal learning and making sense of everything. So we're all in the midst of this new social situation under the pandemic, so things are changing rapidly, and I'm sure you're very well aware of that. So this is what I mean by literacy. I wanted to be sure we all have the same definition, because our students are literate. They are not illiterate. They have been practicing some form of literacy all their life, no matter what age they come to us. And of course, even if you have the youngest students, they employ literacy to get their needs met. You know, the first things little kids ask for are cookies and juice, and that is what we mean by it helping you reach your goals. So the key is to try to figure out what literacies are they already using. So how can we discover what the tools and thinking processes our students are already using? And this is what I mean by looking past deficit. Certainly there are things they are not prepared to use, but they have many assets that they are bringing to the classroom. So the quickest way is to ask them and then honor their answers through celebration and congratulation, and then show them how one type of literacy transfers to the other. Like my student example of my at-risk students who are excellent at reading character. They can do it in text. So I'm going to take you through an assignment that I used with my upper level students. You'll of course want to adapt this for your other students, but at the freshman college era and seniors and juniors, I did ask them to craft for me at the beginning of the year a literacy biography. So I'm going to take you through my model literacy biography, because this is what I did with my students. I told my story to them and paused at certain places and asked them to write about their memories, and then also share those memories with their classmates. So this is about me as a reader and a writer. And of course, I hope it exemplifies to them that, you know, you don't just walk into a classroom knowing everything. You have to go through this trajectory and get yourself there. I was really surrounded by reading. I had an older brother and a sister and a younger brother and a sister. There were 5 in my family, and my younger sister is not yet born. This is me with the hat on. And so those people were already reading so far as I could remember, my older brother and sister, and I really wanted to be like them, and they could read everything. Also, my parents read to us. So my mother had been a teacher. So when we talk about the literacy of school, I was indoctrinated into that literacy from a very early age. So I had a great advantage because my mother had been a teacher and we were well prepared for school and the things to expect. You have students who do not have that advantage, so try to remember that. Since mother read to us, these are the books that I remember from before I was able to read. And I ask the kids to talk about books too that they can remember having been read to after I share mine. The first is a Winnie the Pooh. Mom read a chapter to us every night, and that's what our book looked like. That's how old I am. At some point, my father read to us from Just So Stories. And that's memorable to me because it wasn't very often that my father read to us, so I can remember that quite clearly. Also, we had these books sitting on a shelf, the Childcraft books, which were full of um, nursery rhymes. Maybe you had a set or had seen them in the library. There were crafts you could do on a rainy day, um, all kinds of things that you could look through even if you couldn't read. The Ho Hum book is one that both my mother and grandmother had. I remember this clearly. The book was about a little boy who was so excited to go to the zoo that he skipped his nap. But as he went through the zoo, he kept yawning, ho hum. And his yawning was catching. And so it put all the animals to sleep. And everyone was getting angry with him because they came to see the animals play and he was putting them all to sleep. The marvel of the book was, as they read it to me, I also started to yawn, and pretty soon I was ready for bed. So when I had kids of my own, I looked everywhere for that book. I never could find it. And then this bunny book is another one that I spent a lot of time with. It had Richard Scarry illustrations in it. There was a lot of pictures to look at. It was about a bunny who didn't know what he wanted to be when he grew up. And at the end, he decided he just wanted to be a daddy bunny. So when my siblings started having their children, I found that book and gave it to them as a gift. So these books were read to me, and then I would ask kids, if you were read to, what do you remember reading? Do you remember any stories being told to you? So it doesn't have to always be about the book, but what are their earliest memories of reading or being read to or understanding what reading was? What do they remember? This set of books is another fun one to have the kids explore. When you became an independent reader, what kind of books do you remember choosing for yourself? I'm not sure why I remember all these things, but I do. Ribsy was the first chapter book that I read. So I was really proud of that. I got to read a chapter book, and I remember that feeling of not wanting it to end. I spent a lot of time in the Nancy Drew books. And by the way, these series books are important in the development of readers because the patterning of the books is familiar. So that gives the children a level of safety so they can read one after the other without having, and it frees up their cognition to take in a lot of vocabulary. So you will find kids hang out in a series for a while, which is great. After a while, they may tire of it and move on. As I did, I didn't read all the gazillion Nancy Drew books that were there, but I definitely read a lot of them. Somewhere along the line, I found historical novels. I read several of The Little House on the Prairie, and when I found out where those were in the library, I went back to those shelves over and over again. I spent some time in science fiction. I remember reading A Wrinkle in Time and thinking it was awesome. And then when I went to read Harry Potter books as an adult, I wasn't quite as impressed. Of course, your memories are much stronger when you're younger than when you're older. And then under the influence of my older brother, I read a lot of Ray Bradbury. I can remember reading those in the back seat of the car on the trips that we drove on. So this is another place to ask kids, what kinds of books when you get to pick the books, what kinds of books do you pick? And think about that. This is a category that is fun. I use this a lot with the high school students. Books I was proud to read. So this Gone with the Wind was an important part of my development. I remember taking my own money to buy this book, and I had one goal, which was to get the fattest book that I could find. And Gone with the Wind is a fat book. It turned out to also be a good story. I didn't know that when I chose the book. It was a great story, so I read the whole thing. But this had to do with forming my identity as a reader. I wanted to be seen as someone who could read. And you may think that some of your less successful readers don't feel that way either, but I always had a lot of high school students who would pick up The Stand by Stephen King, even though I knew it was very hard for them to read that book, but it was a big fat book and they wanted to be seen carrying that book around. So that's something to think about when you watch the behaviors of your students. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was an assigned book. I hated it, but I finished it. So I was proud to have stuck through that. And then Jane Eyre I read as I think I was in the 8th or 9th grade, and I chose that myself, and I knew it was a classic, and I liked the story, and I was really proud of myself for finishing that. And then another category, this is going to depend on the age of your students, is the last best great book that you've read. And here are 3 that I thought were awesome. East of Eden by John Steinbeck. I always taught Grapes of Wrath, but this book was way better than Grapes of Wrath. And in my head, would have been a better choice for high school English. Of course, it has a harlot in it, so I suppose that's why we didn't put it on high school lists. She was a bad girl. Eleanor and Parker, I don't read too much YA novels, too many YA novels, but this one was adorable, and I thought the kids in it were portrayed in such a way that they were believable. Great story. I also like all the John Green books in the YA. He's really good at writing teens. And then The Goldfinch is kind of like a Dickens novel. It has all these intertwining family members. Those were great. So that's another category that you can have them read. And then here's one that's aspirational and probably something that kids don't think about, but is there a book that changed your life? This one, The New Aerobics, I read as a a senior in college. I had to take one more phys ed class in order to graduate, and we were required to read this book. And it was about aerobic exercise, and it changed my life. I started running then, and I still exercise. So that's a pretty good sell for a book. Then you can ask the kids to talk about their writing memories. What do they remember about writing and the first time that they wrote? So mine go back to those early days because my mother was a school teacher. She said we could have a library card when we could write our names. So that was a goal. I wanted to go to the library and check out books like my older brother and sister. And my name was long, Mary Kay Eidsness, lots of letters in there, but I did it. Then I can remember being taught to outline before writing a paper in elementary school, and I could not do it that way. So I remember cheating, and I wrote the paper first, and then I went and made an outline from the paper. That was a writing memory. My handwriting was terrible. I got a D in writing in the 5th grade. When I was in school, writing meant handwriting, not composing. And I remember at least 2 teachers reading my writing as a good example to the class. Of course, they never would say who wrote it, but I knew it was mine. And then I had a poem published in the literary magazine in the 9th grade. So even though, when you guys do these school papers and magazines, they're very important to the student, very important. I remember getting a D on a creative writing piece. It only had the grade D at the top and the word trite on it. And I had struggled on that piece, so I was completely destroyed by that. You can tell I still remember it. And then in the 10th grade, I won a radio-sponsored essay contest. Probably nobody else was up that late listening to the rock opera, but I listened and I wrote the essay and they sent me the album. So that was another hallmark. So all of these things, notice all the identity forming activities, the big fat book, being told I was a good writer, all of these things helped me form an identity as a reader and a writer. So that's my literacy biography, and I want to give you a chance to try it. So if you look at page 7 of the handout, you can use that list there to create your own literacy biography, and consider sharing your past as a model for your students so they can see the journey that you've been on to where you have achieved mastery. Teachers are the master readers and writers in the classroom, and sometimes to kids it can look magical that you just arrive there knowing all that stuff and they can't imagine how they're going to learn all that stuff. So you can take them through your past, tell the good, the bad, the ugly. I always told my students I hated that book I had to read. so they know how people become who you are. So you can use the questions as a guide. You don't need to answer all the questions, just select from the list, choosing ones that make you want to write. So stop the video, pull out the handout, and jot down some things about what you can remember about your own literacy history. So this is how we can find out from our kids what they know. And in a little bit, I'm going to access some things in the handout so you can see other things that we can find out about our kids. But investigating their interests and quizzing them about how literacy works in those interests. And I know that these video games are a huge draw to many of our students, but there's a lot of literate behaviors going on. And now that they can play them online and they're continually texting with each other and challenging each other, there's a lot of informal learning going on there. And we want to be sure they know that they are learning some things, and how can we transfer those skills to what we're trying to get them to do in the classroom. Remember, it isn't our goal to leave them where they are, but to acknowledge their current skill with a variety of literacies, and to use that knowledge and those skills to move them into the dominant literacy represented in schooling. So when you are inquiring into student literacy, you want to be sure that you think about what would they need to help them fashion a literacy history. What kinds of things can you throw out there to get them started on it? We don't want to just ask them to sit down and start writing. The biography that I took you through, I would stop periodically and ask the kids to jot down ideas, just like we do here in this presentation, to talk to each other to see if some of the talk inspires more memories before I ask them to introduce themselves to me through their literate behavior. What kinds of literacies do you think they already are practicing? And remember to encourage them to bring that culture of home into the classroom. We don't want to create that feeling that James Baldwin talked about, that I don't belong here because they are not interested in my kinds of people or their ways of being in the world. Also, what would you do with the information once you get it? So you want to be thinking about that. Okay, this is another stop and write. So if you completed the writing that we have done in this presentation, you have participated in reflective writing. So on this writing, what I'd like you to do is jot down your thoughts about that kind of writing. What about this writing is hard for you? What about this kind of writing is easy for you? So stop the video, write about the kinds of writing, the way you felt as you did the writing we did in this process. So what you've participated in is reflective writing. This goes back to John Dewey. My students always were participating in reflective writing because I wanted to pull the process they had been through to the forefront of their thinking. Dewey envisioned that there were two kinds of thinking. One is the automatic adherence to rules originating from authority. In other words, we're the authority and we're saying, turn to page 27, do this thing, do the other. And so you are adhering to the rules. And then the other is what he called reflective thinking. When you think back over what you've done, there's almost a reflex to then think, well, I did that, now what can I do? Or what can I apply that to next? So any action taken as a result of reflective thinking is what we call intelligent action. In other words, you're taking action based on experience. reflective writing helps you pull that experience out and kind of look at it. So opportunities to reflect will arise from practical events. So when you're not prompted by a teacher, like we have done in this presentation, reflective thinking arises naturally when events leave us disquieted or confused. So we're all going through this pandemic thing. We are all disquieted, we are all confused, and we're probably doing a lot of thinking about that. What does this mean for us? What is coming next? How can I make sense out of all these events? And the other thing that prompts reflection is a sense of wonder or awe. So those of you who are parents can remember when your children were born. Perhaps you've been to a landscape that was just overwhelming. Those are things that throw us into reflection. Teachers can prompt reflection by asking students to review events and then ascribe some meaning to them. And then they look forward by setting new goals and aspirations. So at this point of the year, at the early part of the year, it's a great time to get kids to reflect on all the things that have come before they enter into your classroom. What are you good at? What do you like? All of those things that we want them to think about. And then set some goals for them. And that's learning. So I do want to change this. I'm going to stop share for a second so that I can show you another slide. Oh boy, I hope I can find it. Hang on, I'm looking. The SOLs indicate that reflection now is a part of the SOLs in, and I'm not finding my thing. Hang on just a second, sorry. This is what happens when we do things in real time. So we're just going to pretend it's real time. And luckily you can scrub ahead and you don't have to worry about. I do want to show you these SOLs. So the new SOLs, English Language Arts, have reflective writing all the way through, beginning in the 6th grade and going all the way through to 12th grade. And they're only in the English Language Arts ones, but the reflection is important in every one of our classes. And it is because of what Dewey said. If we can get kids to write about what they've done and think about it and why did it work, then they can take that knowledge and apply it to the next situation, which is what we call intelligent action. So no matter what their lives are like, you can get them to reflect on the literacy that they are already employing in their lives. Then we can begin to think about, well, how can we bridge that to the next task? You know, you're already good at this here. How can we do it somewhere else? Now, they don't start asking for reflective writing until the 6th grade, but I think we can get students writing, reflecting starting in kindergarten. And it's very important that they think about what it is that they have done. So back to this. Let me show you just a little bit more about what you can do to get kids to show you what they're good at. I used to do this with 9th graders. It's called Stump the Teacher. So I gave them a long lesson about reading and how reading works. This was part of my master's studies, like how do people learn to read and what do you do when it's hard, and all that cognition that goes on during reading. And then I asked them to stump the teacher, which was to go home and find something that they could read that they thought I would have trouble with. And remember, they can find this all over the place. And remember, the literacies are confined to things that you're interested in. So I don't have students right now, but I can imagine that someone would bring me this article on fantasy football. And what I would do is read it cold and then do the metacognitive thinking right in front of them so they could see what happens when I struggle, because teachers struggle too. So I'm just going to do a little bit of this so you can see what it might look like. So 2019 fantasy football draft prep. Don't want to draft list starts with Todd Gurley, Ben Roethlisberger. Okay, I'm not a big football fan, so I don't know who these guys are. I know a little bit about fantasy football because I have two sons-in-law who play it, and I think it has something to do with you make up your own team and then you, I don't know, you bet on how they're going to do. I'm not sure how that works. So that's my thinking out loud. I'm trying to figure out what this article is going to be about a little bit. So the subtitle says, who are the players you should avoid at their current ADPs? ADP, I do not know what that is. Dave Richards shares his annual don't want to draft list to help you eliminate mistakes on draft day. Okay, this guy's going to give me a list of football players I don't want on my team. So that might be helpful, I think. Here's some simple draft advice. Don't draft players you don't buy into. Okay, that makes sense. I wouldn't do that probably. Simple philosophy, right? Fantasy football is about building and maintaining a team with players you believe in. Okay, I was right. Fantasy football is making up your own team. Why louse it up with players you just don't think are going to be great? Right. I don't want good players, bad players. Every year I release a list of players who I'm avoiding at their current average draft position. Average? I see these capital letters, average draft position. Oh, wait. ADP. Now I know what ADP is. Okay, average draft position. I'm not really sure how that works, but anyway, so you get the idea. I hope that what you do is the kids who can read this well are going to feel like heroes, and you are going to show them how you struggle with something that you don't quite understand, doing the metacognitive skills, showing your active reading skills in front of them. So that's another way to find out what the kids know and are bringing in, you know, their assets that they're bringing to the classroom. So I do want to show you the handout just because I want to show you what resources are in there. These reflective questions that I hope you can get kids writing. Let me find the handout. There's a ton of them in the handout. And these are all ways of getting kids to talk about their literacy or let you know what they're already good at. So for instance, there are some homework assignments that kids will do, the Stump the Teacher I talked about, but this one's great for getting kids to take on the responsibility of their own literacy. And since they're all at home, or most of them are at home, getting them to figure out how they're going to do their schoolwork at home can be part of your assignment. Like, so this one is take a look around your home for possible reading spots and make some notes about what you find. What kinds of places can you find? Make notes about whether certain places might be better for different kinds of reading. For example, the kitchen table might be good for some things. Your bed might be good for other things. The steps outside might be good for still other kinds of reading. If your home isn't the place where you would do your best reading, then write about a place you could get to easily that might work better for you. So that is one way of getting kids to go like, oh, I can control this. There's activities for investigating existing literacies in here. There's some sheets about how they can reflect on their process. This is how a student prepares a writing assignment. And there's some, if you don't want them reflecting with words, they can reflect with pictures. We already looked at the life history question. This is an interest, a self-assessment, so you can start identifying what literacies they have working in their life. And then questions that explore writing and reading, and of course adapt them to your students' level, put them in a format that they can share through drawings or check marks or stars. So start looking at your students, I hope, from the assets that they bring. Use the early part of the year to start asking them what they're already doing and how these things show up in their life so you can celebrate. I hope that's helpful to you and that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye.